It's certainly a busy day in Washington. There's a lot of events going on today, so we're also competing with the event at CSIS on Russia-Polish relations, and so we're delighted that you were able to come here today and be a part of our event. My name is Glenn Howard. I'm president of the Jamestown Foundation. We are taping this event. It will be broadcast or be placed on YouTube afterwards on our own Jamestown YouTube channel, so please look for the announcement for that. We have had a lot of people come here today from Belarus and from other parts of the world that are going to be playing a very key role in our discussions. If you're watching us on Twitter, our hashtag is Jamestown Belarus, so look for us. Please tweet something and say something about the event today. We did have a very good turnout with reservations for the event, but obviously a lot of competing things are going on in Washington. But we're happy that you're here. So the title of our event today is The West and Belarus, a Mutual Discovery. And many of us who have had a chance to travel to Belarus and learn a little about the country, it's certainly for me and my own understanding of this part of the world, of Eastern Europe, or East Central Europe, is the fact that Belarus is very a fascinating country that the more you go there, the more fascinating things you learn about it. And I think that is what intrigues people, but the most about it, and it's certainly changed recently. So there's a lot of things we know about it, but there's a lot of things we don't know. So we at Jamestown, fortunately, have received a grant from a major U.S. foundation to help us explore the growing geopolitical importance of Belarus, and in a project we're calling Growing Importance of Belarus on NATO's Baltic Flank. Our aspiration in this is basically to try to help people, policymakers, understand more about what Belarus is, what is its basic economics, the energy security, the role and changing role of nationalism, questions about national identity, the directions. All of this that I've mentioned have dramatically accelerated after 2014. So Belarus is increasingly becoming a very important country into geopolitics, and some would say even as a pivot of Europe, but it's certainly between East and West, and it has aspirations to continue improving its relations with the United States and with Brussels, while maintaining a certain level of close relations with neighboring Russia. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to the issue of sovereignty. So all these we will explore today, and we have a lot of interesting topics, and many of these people have spent a lot of time in Belarus writing about it. We're fortunate that some of these people have been here in Washington before, others have not. Mr. Shraibman is his first visit to Washington, so we certainly want to give him a big Washington welcome. Andrew Wilson is certainly someone that's known to those experts who follow Ukraine and Belarus, and so we're delighted that Andrew's here, and Vlad Socor is once more here, and of course Grigory Ioffe, who's come all the way up from Southern Virginia to participate in the event today. So yes, he's still experiencing jet lag. So as I said, what we plan to do today is talk about Belarus as a country and learn more about it. And of course, what's facilitated that is in the recent years is the ability to travel to Belarus without any visa required for European tourists who are now discovering Belarus. They can learn the things about Belarus history that many of us don't know, the land of Chagall, a place where Lee Harvey Oswald once lived, the famous Soviet gymnast Olga Korbut, Belarus as the other part of the Grand Duchy that many people didn't know about. It certainly was a killing field of the World War II, vast devastation at the hands of the Germans, and the battle for Belarus that was won by the Belarus partisans who operated from the country's swamps. And as many of you know, the history of the Bielski brothers. And if you haven't seen the movie, watch Daniel Craig's film Defiance, which is based upon the Bielski brothers. And not far from Pennsylvania Avenue, we have the Kushner family and Jared Kushner, whose grandparents met in the resistance movement in Belarus during the Second World War. And so it does touch American society. But one of the things that recently American policymakers started doing is looking at the map. And they suddenly realized that there's something called strategic geography. And Belarus has had a role in history. It's often been an invasion corridor, much to its regret, and to something which it's certainly suffered from. but it's certainly a country that also has a strategic gap next door. Now, we have Ben Hodges that's appearing today. Ben Hodges coined the term originally was Suwalki Gap by using it when he's commanding General U.S. Army in Europe. Since he joined CEPA, he's renamed it the Suwalki Corridor, thanks to Janusz's input. But maybe today we'll hear about the Smolensk Gap, and another strategic corridor that has, through history, been one of the largest tank invasion corridors in the history of modern warfare. So there's things called the Smolensk Gap. There's a lot of things that we're going to learn about Belarus today. You have some of the best experts around, and we're fortunate that we have George Kent, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, who's here for European and Eurasian Affairs, who's prominently involved with issues related to Belarus. And so many of you have seen him on television recently, and today he will be talking about policy issues for a change. So we're delighted to have him, and we're also honored to have as our guest Deputy Foreign Minister of Belarus, Oleg Kravchenko, who will be here speaking today as well. So on that note, my esteemed colleague, Janusz Bugajski, will now moderate this wonderful panel. Janusz, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Glenn. Let me begin by congratulating you, Glenn. Glenn has worked tirelessly over the years to bring Belarus to Washington, and has recently published a monograph on a country that should not be forgotten, entitled The Growing Importance of Belarus, which is available outside. Also, by the way, at CEPA, two of my colleagues have just published a shorter report entitled Will Belarus Choose the West? Glenn, we have certainly come a long way since we first started to explore the possibility of engaging with or re-engaging with Belarus about 10 years ago. At that time, Oleg Kravchenko was in charge of the embassy in DC and reaching out for contacts with policy institutes so that Belarus would no longer be a forgotten country with a one-dimensional image in US policy circles. Glenn and myself believed then, as we do now, that engagement with Belarus is important for the national security interests of both countries. Anyway, that said, that's my little bit, that said, our first panel I think is going to tackle some of the most basic questions, but with very complex answers. And this is regarding the search for Belarus's identity and for Belarusian identity. And I have four introductory points, or actually four sets of questions that the panelists may consider or completely disregard. It's up to them. First of all, has Belarus's identity been rediscovered or reimagined or reinvented, as some analysts of ethno-nationalism describe it? And if so, how deep are its foundations, whether in language, history, religion, society, psychology, or other dimensions? And is the government encouraging, discouraging, or controlling this rediscovery? Second set of questions. Is it useful to distinguish, I think it is, between ethnic and national identity on the one hand and state identity on the other? How do the two reinforce each other in Belarus? We have seen that in times of adversity and outright attack, as in Ukraine, state and national identity tend to bond and strengthen amongst the majority population. Will state and national identity strengthen or weaken in Belarus if the country, for instance, is pressed to form a more closer union with Russia? Or will we witness more pronounced divisions in the country? Third set of questions, how wide, pervasive, and long-lasting is Belarusian identity? Are there major regional differences or generational differences? Identity is often defined or counterposed to other identities, which may be, as a result, minimized or rejected. So what I'm asking is, what is the relation between Belarusian identity and Russian identity, or even post-Soviet identity? And are these all separating? And fourth, geostrategically important, of course, what are the reactions to Belarusian re-identification, especially from Russian officials and elites, who have traditionally viewed Belarusians as a stream of Russians? And what impact do these reactions in turn have on Belarus itself? Is Belarusian identity being strengthened by claims from Moscow that it is exaggerated or artificial, or even Russophobic? So that's my launch pad for what I am sure will be very informative presentations from our four panelists. And our order of battle begins with Grigory Ioffe, professor of human geography, Radford University, who plans to focus on the tug-of-war over Belarus's identity. Second, we'll have Artyom Shraibman, journalist and political commentator at tut.by, who's really forward-looking and will consider, quote, scenarios for Belarus after 2030. Andrew Wilson, on my left here, professor in Ukrainian Studies, University College London, and senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, is going to focus on soft-Belarusianization and Russia's reaction. And last but not least, our very own Vladimir Socor, senior fellow, Jamestown Foundation, with an intriguing presentation on de facto non-alignment, modeling an option for Belarus. We have, I think, about an hour and 45 minutes, or presumably we can run over, and a very inquisitive audience, so I don't want you to overload them too much, but let's try and keep it to about, we said about 15 minutes if possible. Okay, so let's start order of battle, as I said, start with you, Grigory.
Thank you. It's an honor and responsibility to begin. I think some of what my presentation will contain will address at least some of the questions that you just posed, especially the first one, and to some extent the fourth one. A national survey conducted in August of this year by a Belarusian analytical workroom under Andrei Vardamatsky revealed 55% of Belarusians prefer integration with Russia, and 55% prefer integration with Russia, and 25% with the European Union. Most commentators were quick to emphasize an 8 or 9 point decline in leanings to Russia during just 1 year, and the fact that only 1.4% of Belarusians prefer Belarus to become what they call the subject of the Russian Federation, to enter the Russian Federation. But Piotr Rudkovsky, who chairs a Minsk-based research unit funded by the West, reflected on the content of the paper containing the survey results and on its title. And the title read, Russian Values and European Goodies, or European Largesse. And he bemoaned that whereas attraction to Europe hinges on materialistic motives like visa-free travel, like higher possibility of higher earnings, attraction to Russia is driven by value-laden motives such as common history, mentality, and language. A more nuanced analysis would suggest that Belarusians are unevenly split between two historical narratives at war with each other. Let me call one of them Russocentric / neo-Soviet, and the other one the westernizing narrative. A historical narrative is important anyway because it's a flip side of collective identity. The 2016 survey by the Institute of History, Belarusian Academy of Sciences, confirmed that in Belarusians' collective memory, the most important events are in descending order: the Soviet Union's victory in the Great Patriotic War of 1941-45, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and Chernobyl. It's ironic that acquisition of Belarusian statehood appears less important than the breakup of the Soviet Union, although both events are two sides of the same coin. However, indirectly, this upholds the idea that the Soviet Union was the entity that Belarusians deemed their homeland and within which they began to perceive themselves en masse as a community. So the Russocentric narrative, which is what essentially showed up in this survey by the Institute of History, does not reject pre-Soviet Belarusian history in principle, but it downplays it quite a bit. The physical transfer of Francisc Skarina street name in Minsk is an apt metaphor of this attitude. In 1991, the main street in Minsk was named Skarina Avenue in honor of an educator, pioneer printer, and Bible translator born in Polotsk, in the city of Polotsk in 1470. But in 2005, Skarina was exiled, as it were, to the city's northern periphery, where a significant but secondary street was named after him, whereas the main street was renamed Independence Avenue. This reshuffling of street names implied the political establishment's continued willingness to pay respect to Skarena, but with a new sense of proportion. The acquisition of independence, the Great Patriotic War, and the October 1917 revolution, all those assets of collective memory were declared more important, which is what is reflected in street names in downtown Minsk. As for the communist revolution, just 2 weeks ago or so, President Lukashenko once again underscored how instrumental it was in the emergence of independent Belarus, the only successor state of the Soviet Union that still celebrates the revolution's anniversary. Other hallmarks of the neo-Soviet narrative include a belief that all three anti-Russian uprisings on Belarusian lands, those of 1794, 1830, and 1863, were essentially Polish uprisings, and that Belarusian peasantry was not on the rebel side, that Belarus is a partisan or guerrilla republic because of an effective underground partisan movement during World War II, and that the most important date in Belarusian history was liberation of Minsk from the Nazis by the Soviet army on July 3rd, 1944. It is this day that is celebrated as the Independence Day. In my paper, I invoke the explanation of that phenomenon by the historian Yuri Shevtsov, who emphasized that the war brought about the first ever powerful outburst of, as he put it, Belarusian national feeling, and that after the war, ethnic Belarusians became for the first time the ethnic majority in their cities. And the leaders of the partisan movement won one more battle after the war, the battle for the corridors of power in Minsk. So partisan leaders such as Kirill Mazurov and especially Pyotr Masherov, who presided over Soviet Belarus, are fondly remembered. There are several factors sustaining the neo-Soviet historical narrative, political indoctrination being just one of them. Perhaps the most important factor is delayed ethnic self-awareness of Belarusians, delayed as compared with ethnic self-awareness of some neighboring peoples. One of the fateful implications of this delay is that Belarusians' formative experience as a community, and even the self-name Belarusians, was internalized during the Soviet period, prior to which they used to identify as Tuteyshia, or locals. Now, when the authors of the Institute of History survey concluded, which they did, that perception of the past is relatively homogeneous in Belarusian society, this was just because most Belarusians effectively adhere to the neo-Soviet/Russocentric account of Belarusian history. However, even a superficial familiarity with Belarusian media, as well as communication with average Belarusians, confirm that their historical memory is not as uniform as would appear from the survey that I just invoked. Along with the neo-Soviet version, the westernizing one, sometimes called National Democratic, is available too. This narrative is technically even older than the Russocentric one because it goes back to the survey of Belarusian history, authored as early as 1910 by Václav Lastovsky. However, this narrative's headway into the public consciousness hit two obstacles and never gained traction. The initial blow came in the 1930s, when close to 300 Belarusian intellectuals fell victim to repressions. Subsequently, the westernizing version of Belarusian history was espoused by collaborationist structures under German occupation during World War II. The third resurgence of the westernizing historical discourse came about during Gorbachev's perestroika. What are the main building blocks of this narrative, the westernizing one? A, relations between Belarus and Russia have been relations between a colony and the metropolis. B, Belarus is a European entity that should shake off the layers of Soviet history and return to Europe. And C, during World War II, two equally alien forces fought each other on the territory of Belarus, Nazism and Stalinism, and Belarusians fell victim to both and to their mutual clash. There are several canonical texts propagating this specification of historical memory, and I invoked one of them in my paper. One of its refrains is that Belarusians are descendants of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a consistently European entity that used to fight barbaric and Asiatic Russia, and that the anti-Russian uprisings were not just Polish, but also Belarusian, as nobilities with local roots took part in those uprisings. One of them, Konstanty or Kastus Kalinovsky, is glorified in particular. The major national holiday of Belarus, according to this view, is the anniversary of the Belarusian People's Republic, proclaimed on March 25th, 1918, and the genuine insignia of Belarus are the white-red-white flag, and the coat of arms, very much similar to the national seal of Lithuania. Besides political indoctrination that has worked against this version of history, it has two Achilles heels of its own. One of them is what favors the neo-Soviet narrative. Belarusians' formative experiences as a national community have birthmarks and trappings of the Soviet period because that is when Belarusians first identified themselves as a community. Not when Belarusian idea was born. It was born before in some circles, but when it became internalized en masse by people living in Belarus. The second vulnerability has to do with treatment of World War II and of Belarusian collaborators of the Nazi occupiers. This is what doesn't sit well with many ordinary Belarusians. In his famous essay, Without Us, the Belarusian philosopher Valentin Akudovich described Belarusian westernizers, including himself, as internal emigres whose worldview is far detached from that of the majority of Belarusians. Although written 18 years ago, the essay is still topical. Like Piotr Rutkovsky, whom I quoted in the very beginning, Akudovich bemoans this situation, but prefers to see things as they are. Now, following a description this disheartening, it might seem surprising that I am now ready to share evidence of the westernizing platform's resilience. Indeed, in 2018, the government allowed a public concert in downtown Minsk commemorating the centennial of the Belarusian People's Republic. This last June, the opening ceremony of the European Games in Minsk included a theatrical performance with scenes from Belarusian history that had previously not been glorified by the official historical narrative. Besides costumes by Leon Bakst and paintings by Chagall, these included a showcase of Vytautas, also known as Vytautas the Great, the ruler of the Grand Duchy, and his knights. The performance was accompanied by the recitation of poems written by Yanka Kupala, Maxim Bogdanovich, and Adam Mickiewicz, who was born in what is modern-day Belarus. Moreover, the Institute of History has released the first of its 5-volume history of the first volume in the 5-volume history of the Belarusian state. The narrative presented in this work broadly reflects that of Václav Lastovsky's volume, very thin volume of 1910, the author of the first westernizing course of Belarusian history that I mentioned earlier. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania has already been integrated into the official historical discourse. And monuments to the Grand Duchy statesmen have appeared in the cities of Slonim, Lepel, Vitebsk, Grodno, and Lida. I think about Novogrudok is about to follow suit. 1 year ago, a monument approved by the Ministry of Culture was finally installed in Kuropati, a site of executions under Stalin. What is going on is perhaps inconsistent and yet more advanced than ever before, consolidation of the Belarusian historical discourse. While the neo-Soviet streak still dominates it, it has already incorporated quite a few elements of the westernizing narrative. Why is this happening? First, it's the allure of the West. For centuries, Europe's East has looked up to the West, and this is not going to change anytime soon. Second, whenever relations between Russia and Belarus deteriorate, the inherently Russocentric politics of memory turns to Belarusian westernizers and borrows something from them. This is spontaneous, not an outcome of some insidious Western indoctrination. Little wonder that this process intensified dramatically after March 2014, which Glenn invoked in his introductory speech, March 2014, when Crimea was annexed. The third factor is that the Russian language, Russian channels of information, Russian investment, and a Russian-like outlook have diluted Belarusian sense of being a community apart from Russia so much that the pendulum has finally begun to move in the opposite direction. This movement is promoted by popular misgivings over putative annexation of Belarus by Russia. For Belarusians to finally adopt a strong collective identity, the identity that unites rather than divides, some sense of detachment from Russia and Russians appears to be a necessary prerequisite. That does not necessarily spell hostility, but it does, by its very nature, reflect some degree of alienation. In the future, much will depend on a combination of factors, including economic development, how successful it is, interstate relations with Russia, circumstances surrounding the inevitable change at the helm of power, sooner or later, as well as civic maturity of Belarusian westernizers themselves. At present, it leaves much to be desired, but the availability of such thinkers as Valentin Akudovich in their ranks may help temper unrealistic expectations and encourage them to proceed with advanced knowledge and patience. Belarus will be getting more Belarusian as a result. This process is already underway. Thank you.
Thank you, Grigory. Right on time, actually, to the second. Thanks very much. You set a good standard. Artyom, you're next.
Thank you. It would be probably far easier and preferable for me to speak about the past or about the present, but Glenn asked me to do another thing. And it's to speak about the future. And when he first tasked me with this paper and with this speech, I thought that he must have lost his mind to write about such an issue in such a region where the events are probably the least predictable they can be. But then, despite my inner opposition, I started working on this paper. I understood that the task was actually far more challenging and interesting than it appeared to be. I would like to start with a disclaimer. Of course, all the scenarios, all the projections that I'm going to be laying out are relative and very, schematic in a way, and also all four of them are most likely not to materialize. And sorry to start with such a disclaimer, but I am saying this because if we look at the Belarusian recent past, the Belarusian, let's say, past decade or so, all the events that shaped the course of the country development were fundamental and unpredictable and foreign in relations to Belarus. And we may start even from the beginning of the 21st century with the surge of oil prices, which triggered Belarusian, as some call it, economic miracle, then Russian wars with Georgia and Ukraine, financial crisis of 2008. All of these events, trends have had a profound effect on Belarusian politics, economy, geopolitical positioning, so on and so forth. And it would be safe to presume that the similar kind of black swans, for the lack of a better term, will also shape Belarusian future. Therefore, since such events are fundamental and predictable, we can safely assume that these scenarios are just some, let's say, tracks on which Belarus can go, but from which it will most likely diverge. But before we proceed to such a distant future as 2030, I would like to start with the more closer perspective and describe some trends I consider to be very likely to unfold before 2025, so that it would shape us and lead us to the discussion about 2030. First of all, it's a very topical issue. In my estimation, we can speak about this in the Q&A, and I will be pleased to answer more of your questions on this. There will be no deeper integration resulting from the current talks with Russia. This is an almost certain trend. Sides are not ready for what is being sometimes alluded in the Western media. Belarusian leadership and public to this degree will object any real attempt to absorb Belarus, and the superficial concessions will not actually be enough for Russia to resume the previous levels of economic benefits. Almost certainly we will witness the process that has already started in Belarus, the shrinking role of state sector in economy. Despite what is often being told about Belarusian government, Belarusian president, who are reluctantly, very reluctant to start in market reforms, if you look at the numbers, the state sector has been shrinking now for almost 10 years. If we compare just number of people working for state enterprises 7 years ago and today, the state sector lost a quarter of its workforce, 25%, and it's without the political decision to undertake reforms. I would even argue that this process will accelerate in future due to various trends I'll be describing. Very likely we'll witness the further sovereignization of foreign policy, also as a result of the either gradual or more or less abrupt collapse of the integrational talks, which I would say is imminent. And also because Belarusian leadership to a degree has felt the taste of what a more sovereign, a more, as my friend Evgeny calls it, situationally neutral foreign policy can bring. We will likely witness the update of the constitution to prepare for a country for a transition of power. Lukashenko has been discussing this idea for several years now, but this year he was particularly, vocal and repetitively vocal about this. The idea now, as it being discussed by the country's leadership, is to delegate some powers to the parliament and to the government from the president's level. And even Lukashenko does not hide the reason for this initiative, which is not to give his successor the same constitution that he currently has, which is basically as what political scientists would have called it, a super presidential republic, with president domineering over other branches of power, even legally, constitutionally, not just de facto. And Lukashenko himself set the deadline for this. He said that half a year ago, he said that it will be done probably in a 5-year term. So we are having our eye on the 2024, 2023 probably. I would not be so sure and so fast to believe that this deadline cannot be moved. Given the circumstances, external and internal, I believe we can witness some movement of this deadline further, and we'll speak about this later. But generally speaking, Lukashenko seems serious about updating the constitution. Now, this is just maybe for some fun, but this trend is, in my estimation, very unlikely. And it is important because I, from the start, removed it from my analysis because of many factors that we can go in deep discussion later. There are no prerequisites in Belarus for any sort of grassroots protest-led toppling of the president of the government. First of all, due to the dramatic imbalance of powers between what is called the regime and its most hardline opponents. Now, why I stick to number 4 as the number of scenarios? It's basically very easy. It's because I chose 2 variables for my analysis, which are, in my estimation, not predictable, how they will choose these 2 variables. And the combination of 2 answers to these 2 questions produces 4 scenarios. And you will now see what I mean by this. And the first variable is whether in the result of the economic troubles that await us because of the problems in the relations with Russia, probably world crisis, which sometimes has also been predicted, and the decay of the Belarusian state sector economy, whether these economic troubles will trigger social unrest in Belarus, which will in its turn trigger governmental crackdown on it. So I call this variable domestic turbulence. Why this matters? Because if Belarusian regime, Belarusian government opts for crackdown on the social unrest triggered by this crisis, and if it will be sufficient enough to be called authoritarian consolidation, or as I put it, then it would probably limit Belarusian foreign, let's say, space for maneuver, because it will upset the West, to put it mildly, and or at least lead the decision makers in Washington and Brussels to lose the Romanian enthusiasm to engage Belarus that is already, some would argue, evaporates. And this is one, let's say, value of this variable. And the second one is, and of course, the reverse of the domestic stability. So either the state of economy or crisis in economy doesn't trigger any social unrest, or government is able to deal with it without tough crackdowns. So the relations with the West are not harmed by the domestic problems. So this variable can take two values. Now, the next is how Russia will react to integrational talks either collapse or them getting drowned into bureaucracy or producing only superficial results. Some would argue, and with some grounds, that Russia will become assertive, that Russia will be alarmed that Belarus can be slipping out of its control, and there will be a new wave of increased pressure on Minsk to force some sort of closer alignment. And by this I mean not just the current degree of pressure, or what cannot be even properly described as pressure, because Russia for now more or less withdraws the benefits that it gave recently to Belarus. But what I mean by pressure, increased pressure in this assertive Russia scenario, is full-on political, pressure coupled with informational warfare, maybe economic sanctions-like measures, like closing Russian markets for some goods, and needless to say, the removal of oil and gas preferential terms of trade. And once again, there are analysts who believe that Russia will not tolerate the collapse of the integration talks and will switch to this mode. And the another option is non-assertive Russia. By non-assertive Russia, I don't mean that Russia will be will become Canada of the Eurasia. Of course not. The idea is that Russia is more or less satisfied with integration talks producing zero results, because it gives Russia rationale, let's say, or justification for washing its hands, for basically saying, okay, you don't want it, you will not get any more subsidies, you will not get any more preferential terms of trade on oil and gas, and you can live on its own, on your own, realizing that Belarus, especially under the current president, doesn't have much room or much space to go to. In this circumstance, in this scenario, distancing between two countries will proceed naturally, simply because the economic relations will sour and deteriorate and diminish. Now, these four variables produce four scenarios when they combine in different configurations. This is, I think, needless to explain. And we'll start with the first one. And now we are speaking about the more long-term 2030 perspective. And once again, this might sound a little bit speculative, so sorry in advance. In this scenario, with domestic stability, but an assertive Russia, there is a mix of, as I've said, informational and economic pressure from Moscow from basically early 2020s onward. Belarus loses its preferential conditions of energy supplies and access to Russian market, not entirely, I mean preferential access. And what would likely follow from this is Belarusian leadership will further cultivate the national identity and sovereignty, ideas within Belarus, because it would be the natural response to what would be perceived as Russia being on assault. So we need to defend ourselves, we need to rally around the flag, as some political scientists would put it. So more of this consolidation, pro-consolidation, pro-national unity narrative. But economy in this scenario stagnates. However, Minsk is able to deal with domestic problems without setback in relations with the EU and the US. So this is the given in this scenario. At the same time, given that Russia has become assertive, there is no political drift to the West, needless to say. However, closer economic ties with the EU and possibly new IMF program, possibly trade diversification, and even with the energy supplies diversification, will become almost imminent in this scenario because Russia will be falling off as an economic patron. Needless to say that in this scenario, the liberalization of Belarusian economy will accelerate. The state sector will further, its role will further be decreasing. And I would say that much depends on the readiness of Western decision makers and financial institutions to develop economic ties, to give some boost to economic ties, or in other words, to give its helping hand to Belarus, which will not now be in a very serious economic troubles vis-a-vis Russia. Given that Russian pressure accelerated and we are now basically in the situation of the more, persistent Russian efforts to limit Belarusian space for foreign policy maneuver, I would say that some concessions are possible because there is a degree to the resilience of Belarus. And I would say that the concessions will start from privatization of probably oil refineries or some military industries, but I would argue that they will not go to the level of letting, integrational bodies, supranational bodies absorb some of Belarusian sovereignty, because this is for Belarus, for Belarusian leadership, the last resort. There are far more concessions on the way possible in this scenario where Russia is particularly assertive than just giving sovereignty on the line. In this scenario, power transition will be delayed because this is quite a stressful scenario. There will be no liberalization in the country, needless to say, partly out of the fears that Kremlin, which is now assertive, will intervene and will try to use the fruits of the liberalization for its own purposes. The successor will be handpicked and probably with a security background to, I would say, keep the country stable in stressful times. And I cannot speculate about the timing of this. However, what is sure is that by 2030, whether or not Belarus will still have President Lukashenko or his successor, there will be roughly the same geopolitical positioning as we have now. Belarus will be formally a Russian ally, but relations will be strained because of all above mentioned reasons. And Belarus, because its relations with the West has not soured, has not worsened, can continue playing its current mediator or peace donor role, but to the degree there is a demand for it, because in the end, not all depends on Belarusian efforts in this direction. Much depends on if there is a readiness of key player to communicate and then choose Belarus as its venue for dialogue. Now, that's basically it for the scenario one. Now proceeding to the scenario two, which is, I would argue, we have to few times. Sorry, I'll be moving faster. Yeah, definitely. Which is arguably the most stressful scenario for Belarus and for Belarusian authorities in particular, because pressure from Russia in this scenario triggers crisis in Belarus, social unrest, and regime consolidates as a response. There are new crackdowns on opposition, more sustained pressure, and the EU and the US loses patience basically and any enthusiasm to engage Belarus. Belarusian positioning as a regional venue for dialogue and peacemaking is now problematic because due to reputation problems. However, as I've said before, even in these stressful scenarios, compromising political sovereignty is very unlikely because this is the last resort, the last value in place. However, Russian capital in this scenario will almost certainly expand its presence in Belarus. There will be deep economic integration following not just from the desires of the Belarusian government, but because of the basically natural demand of the new economy of Belarus, which will be dominated to this or that degree by Russian capital. What is also likely is Russian military buildup in Belarus, because Minsk will no longer be in this situation compromising its balancing or neutral image in the West, because it has already been lost. In this stressful, restrictive scenario, Siloviki will have more influence in Belarus, its enforcement agencies, and diplomats, people from Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other, let's say, pro-reformist forces will be sidelined. There will be no constitutional experiments in this scenario because this is the most stressful one, and Lukashenko will stay in power for life or will pass the presidency to the closest possible ally, probably even a family member, because the control and the stability of the situation will be the top priority and the top risk. Scenario 3. Domestic turbulence combined with non-assertive Russia. This is situation where Russia saves money on Belarus, realizing that Belarus has nowhere else to go, but economic benefits evaporate. However, Belarusian political stability still fails the stress test, and relation with the EU and the US worsen. In this situation, economic structure changes because it becomes less dependent on Russia and oil refining, because Russia has been removing its support. And since European actors are also now not really able and eager to engage Belarus deeply, third parties like Arab monarchies or China to a degree will become more active investors in Belarus. To a degree, Belarus will remain an attractive place for this investment, and because Belarusian government will now not be in the position to dictate its own conditions to the last remaining potential investors. In this scenario, Moscow and Minsk do not aspire anymore for closer integration because relations have become more or less pragmatic, grown up. And after calming down the domestic unrest, with, in this scenario, it's some sort of crackdown, Lukashenko can approach the power transition because there are no threats on the horizon anymore, but this transition will be, of course, delayed probably until the benchmark of this 2030. And we are approaching to the end. New president who has, of course, a new government who has far less negative baggage with the West and now more pragmatized relations with Russia, which means that Belarus can and will most likely move to some sort of neutrality, non-alignment, as Vladimir would put it, and some formal disengagement from Russia after 2030. And this option also becomes possible. And lastly, fourth scenario, probably the most comfortable one for Belarusian authorities. The relations with Russia follow the scenario 3 template, basically. It's pragmatization, market prices for energy, but with no view to align Belarus closer at all costs. However, there is no turbulence at home, or Belarusian government manages to deal with this turbulence without upsetting dramatically the West. In this situation, Minsk has every incentive to improve the relations with the West, to attract EU assistance, IMF financial loans, and foster trade with new non-Russian markets. Basically, the situation will be demanding this. Gradually, Belarusian and its leadership will get used to the new relations with Russia, but what is more important, it will happen vice versa. Russia will also get, let's say, accustomed to the fact that Belarus is no longer its partner it has to feed constantly. Navigation through these tough economic conditions would require smart, market-oriented technocrats in government for this period of time, for midterm perspective, just as they are now in the Belarusian government. And in this situation, they will be necessary for Lukashenko to be able to maintain this domestic stability and keep the country with evaporating Russian support. And their position by 2025 or beyond this will be strengthening. People like current Prime Minister and his team. Stability at home allows for constitutional reform as planned by 2024 and the transition of power in the early years of after 2025. People like, and I can't stipulate this enough, I'm not speaking about these two particular persons, Mackay and Rumas, who foreign minister and prime minister, but people of their cohort, people with this sort of background and views, will be most likely successors in these circumstances. Still, Russia has less leverage on Belarus in this situation, but much depends on who is in power in Kremlin after power transfer in Russia, and how strong is Russian confrontation with the West, and I cannot predict this with any certainty. If there will be Medvedev-like technocrats, which don't care much about expanding the Russian world and the Russian imperialistic projects, Minsk will start gravitating towards formal neutrality. I'll stop here, and sorry for exceeding my time.
Okay. Thanks, Artyom. I was going to ask you to leave out the fifth and sixth scenarios, but thankfully at this point there weren't any. You gave us a lot of territory there to think about. Andrew, next.
I'll assume that works. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Glenn. I have prepared two sets of remarks for this event. Today I'll talk about Soft-Belarusianization. I've also written a paper that will go online at jamestown.org, which tries to put that in a broader context, foreign policy, Belarus's options to East and West. And I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A, particularly about the prospects for the so-called Union state. But today I'll talk about Soft-Belarusianization, and my remarks will overlap considerably with Grigory's, but hopefully in an interestingly different way. I'd like to start by mentioning this book. Some of you may know it. It's by Serhii Plokhy. It's called Lost Kingdom. This is the power of publishers. It's really about something called the East Slavic idea, but publishers don't like those kind of academic terms on book covers. Because the Lost Kingdom in question is the East Slavic Rus. So it's a long history over 1,000 years of how this was at one time a genuine identity possibility for all three. So the interesting thing, and the book that I plan to write next, would be to update that, starting in 2014. Because I would argue that the events of 2014 have destroyed this residual, the coherence, the feasibility of this residual East Slavic idea. Less so on Russia's side, of course, but on both Ukraine and Belarus's side. Interestingly differently, Ukraine has broken much more radically, is at de facto war with Russia. Ukraine, in this case, is the hare. Belarus, though, is the tortoise, right? Doing the same thing, but more slowly. If you do the same thing more slowly, it doesn't necessarily accumulate to the same degree, but it will be very interesting to compare the two approaches and who gets furthest, fastest. Hence, though, for the moment, the tortoise-like term of soft-Belarusianization. You can pick other adjectives like slow, or I think Gregory was talking about synthetic or eclectic, mashing together of historical narratives. Some people don't like this term because it was used in earlier eras, ironically in the Soviet 1920s, but then again in the 90s before Lukashenko took power in 1994. And Belarusian was then much more radical, much more comprehensive, and certainly not soft. Secondly, people see it as basically instrumental and state-led, top-down. And I would agree. It would be a big part of my argument that a lot of this is driven by foreign policy. So a lot of people don't like to compare what's happening now with what's happening, what historically happened in the 20s and 90s. But it's not entirely top-down, and more on that in a moment. Belarus became independent in 1991. Logically, it could have shifted its priorities towards sovereignty much earlier, at least in the 2000s. But Lukashenko, who was first elected president in 1994, spent his first term as, pick your adjective, a Russocentric, a neo-Soviet, a Slavophile, and using those symbols and ideology to defeat his then national or nationalist opponents, and by seeking to use that to play a role in all Russian politics, often forgotten. The West was then the enemy. True sovereignty for Belarus could only be found under the umbrella of the Union state that was negotiated with Russia, the original Union state, in 1999. But the election of Putin changed quite a lot. It meant the job of Russia's saviour was already taken. The two didn't get on particularly well personally. So Lukashenko withdrew a little, but not a lot. And you can see that in the so-called state ideology that was written in 2003. The interesting thing is that it exists. So it implies a certain degree of state consolidation. But it was pretty neo-Soviet and fairly vacuous. Because the time wasn't really right then for more radical moves. The defeat of that national movement, the National Democratic Movement in the 90s, was too recent. The dismantling of democracy, the unilateral imposition of a new constitution in 1996, delay of elections, the so-called disappearances of Lukashenko's opponents in 99, 2000, all of that meant that support from the West was extremely unlikely. Most important, probably, though, the boom years of the noughties in oil and gas prices, particularly from 2003, war in Iraq, till 2008, global economic crash, were as good for Belarus as they were for Russia. So I would argue that it's basically been other events that have shifted Belarus towards a more sovereign course, namely Russia's wars against Georgia in 2008 and, albeit undeclared, in Ukraine beginning in 2014. So if Belarus had previously bandwagoned with Russia to strengthen its security, often depicted as threatened by expanding NATO, now Russia itself was a conceivable threat to Belarusian sovereignty. More generally, Russian confrontation with the West threatened Belarusian attempts to present itself as neutral, and at a kind of hot conflict level, Lukashenko had no desire to be sucked into the bilateral conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So I would date this soft-Belarusianization really to 2014 onwards. And significantly, cultural measures were accompanied by what you might call, in parallel, soft securitization. Small but significant increases in defense spending, stronger internal defenses against hybrid war, etc. Plus, economic change. Hard to disentangle because it really gains traction at more or less exactly the same time. In the boom years, particularly in the noughties, Lukashenko could offer a generous social contract, welfare and rising living standards in return for lack of real democracy. But the boom years are over, and so to put it crudely, Belarus has to move from a social contract to a security contract. The regime needs extra props of support, not just for statehood as an abstract principle, or nostalgia, or the social contract, expectations for which have been adjusted downwards, but also some cultural and identity props. So my pictures are all slides. I guess that's a tautology. They're slides of posters. That's interesting in itself because Belarus is a kind of propaganda state, so you get a lot of this kind of public agitprop. Early versions were quite bland. For Belarus, exclamation mark. Yeah, great, but it's not really defined what Belarus is. So you've begun to see new tropes, slogans, sort of trying to flesh out the content here. We Belarusians are peaceful people. That obviously marries very well to foreign policy. That's kind of the same. Be Belarusian. It's kind of a civic campaign, and I'll come back to that later. The taste of the Belarusian language. It's obviously a good taste. That's BlackBerry in Belarus. My first word, i.e. my first Belarusian word, love in that one. celebrating particular events and dates. This is Yefrozny of Polotsk, which Grigory mentioned, the early medieval principality. 2018 was the year, sorry, that's in, I'll have to translate that, the year of the small homeland. So celebrating regional identities everywhere in Belarus. Even the war can be sort of slightly Belarusianized. So the flowers of our great victory, you can see the Belarusian national colors that have been given there. Grigory mentioned the celebration of the centenary of the Belarusian People's Republic back in 2018, the event having happened in 1918, which was inconceivable a few years ago. But also in 2018, the 100th anniversary of the Red Army in Belarus and of the Belarusian KGB. Again, proudly with national colours, but obviously that means something rather different. So, shall I leave that one up? I'll put a more pleasant one.
Yeah, friend people.
That one. So we see this very eclectic soft Belarusianization. Has it reached its limits? That is a really interesting question. Lukashenko doesn't want to empower the opposition. He doesn't want it setting the agenda. He doesn't want to provide too many easy targets for Russian propaganda. So some things haven't been done. Grigory mentioned Kuropatki. There was also a conflict basically between a restaurant owner who was trying to develop this complex in the forest and the people who thought that encroached on graves, basically. The restaurant owner won. Also, Lukashenko has basically vetoed ideas to set up a Belarusian language university. Universities, particularly native language ones, might well just churn out too many radical opposition-minded people. So there are some senses that the soft Belarusianization has reached its limits, but also the opposite. It is partly bottom-up, and it does make some sense economically. If we go back through these slides, some of these programs are also run by civil society groups, particularly these two. You used to basically have a problematical two-sided relationship. The state didn't like civil society because it was deemed to be overly political. But now you have a growing private sector in the economy, so that relationship is much more triangular. And one side of the triangle works quite well and independent of the state. So the private sector sponsors many of these soft Belarusian campaigns, which are also good for business. And good for the business of the state. That the state is also branding itself using these kind of images, particularly to promote its role as a centre of diplomacy, etc. So secondly, Russia's reaction, and how much time do I have?
You're finished. No, I'm joking. You've got 5.
Fine. Russia's reaction is hard to read. It's very easy to gauge its extent. And that's considerable. There has been a clear increase in propaganda war against Belarus in the last 2 years in particular. And it often looks exactly like it did against Ukraine. In fact, arguably, it's bigger and it's broader because Russia was quite opportunistic. It intervened in albeit after 3 months of protests in Ukraine, annexed Crimea. A lot of its propaganda has been since then. Whereas here is a kind of much slower burning process. So Russian propaganda has been building up for a kind of longer time. There are structural differences. You can't, it's even more difficult in the case of Belarus to say that everybody is a Nazi, but that doesn't stop the Russians from trying. They certainly talk about, and I apologize for my accent, Batkini nazisti. Batko's Nazis, Batko meaning father being Lukashenko's nickname. But they also talk about other things. Mestechkovi nationalism, I think, is the most significant insult. This means local or small town or hick nationalism. So Belarus isn't a proper country, and to argue that it is just leads you in this kind of small country or locality direction. So it's also a common trope to call this Litvin nationalism. It's a medieval invention. That comes from the name of Litva, the original name for the Grand Duchy. So it's a kind of non-Slavic, completely false invention. But also, if you look more closely, it's a list of foreign policy grievances. So I'll just read one long quote from a Russian source, which attacks the Mackay project. And Mackay is foreign minister. So that's already interesting. Soft-Belarusianization is described as the foreign minister's project. It means the separation from the Russian world, withdrawal from the frontal clash between Russia and the West, which is not possible, becoming a second Switzerland where officials rule the quiet people and capitalize their political and bureaucratic assets. So I'll just pause the quote there. Mackay has indeed talked about Belarus becoming a second Switzerland, but in a good, neutral foreign policy way. So here it's presented as a corrupt oligarchization project. This soft play on sovereignty, as a result of this soft play on sovereignty, Belarus will become, in a few years, an element of Polish, or in fact, American concepts. And the quote goes on to talk about the intermarium, kind of idea of a confederacy of states between the Baltic and the Black Seas. So basically, this is the prediction of what happens to small-town nationalists in Russia's view. They become the tools of larger powers. That said, I did some research for the other project. The Russian analysts say there are at least 3 factions at play in Russia. Unfortunately, they all use the same rhetoric or hide behind the same rhetoric, so it's sometimes difficult to distinguish who's actually driving the propaganda war. One faction, we can call it the Ruski Mir faction. That's the faction that takes the rhetoric most seriously. Second, we can call the value for money faction. They want to get more benefits, more foreign policy loyalty out of the relationship for the same or lesser costs. And a war of words against Belarus helps soften them up to drive that bargain. The third faction are raiders, who, according to one source, are simply looking for sovereignty concession to allow them to gobble up assets. And they use the same rhetoric, but much more cynically. So what I'm basically arguing is that a lot of this cultural policy is actually foreign policy in disguise. That Russia is upping the rhetoric in order either to get more economically or in security terms out of the relationship. That also works the other way. That as that pressure accumulates, it's actually natural for Russia, for Lukashenko, to push the policy a little bit harder, but he knows that if he pushes too hard, you get a reaction from Russia as well. So it's an exercise in minimizing risk, which is actually risky in itself, to quote Yevgeny Pryaman at the back. So I wouldn't want to be too reductionist and say that everything is foreign policy, but I would like to point out that paradox that what looks like cultural policy is often foreign policy in disguise, and I'll stop there.
Great, thanks very much, Andrew. Last but not least, as I keep saying, Vladimir Socor.
Thank you, Janusz. I proceed from 2 assumptions. The first is that Presidents Lukashenko and Putin will be re-elected to another term of office, and they will not make any significant changes during this time to their existing policies. And the second assumption is that it is impossible to package Belarus together with other countries in Europe's east in a project of region-wide security between East and West, trying to shape, to fashion some kind of a non-aligned neutral belt of states. No country in Eastern Europe, in Europe's East, including Belarus, could or should be packaged together with the others. Each country presents its own problems, its own challenges, and its own solutions, differing widely from country to country in Europe's East. Belarus holds a pivotal position on the historical invasion route between Muscovy and the heart of Europe. In this sense, Belarus is a strategic prize of the first magnitude for Russia if Russia were to control this territory. A country such as Belarus, relatively small, certainly peaceful, situated between rival powers or rival power blocks, can be confronted with one or several of the following four scenarios. One scenario would be that of outpost, a staging area in an alliance system, an outpost for an aggressive, anti-status quo power, in which a country like Belarus would be integrated into such an alliance system. Another scenario would be that of bastion. This would be a defensive scenario. Unlike the outpost scenario, it would be a defensive scenario. It would also be part of an alliance system. And the bastion country would be protected within that alliance system. One very distinguished Western official visiting Minsk, who made a significant contribution to the opening to Belarus, declared in Minsk that Belarus could be a bastion against Russian re-expansion alongside Ukraine and Georgia. I believe this was a very premature statement. Belarus does not wish to be a bastion. The other scenario would be that of battleground or contested ground between great powers and power blocks. Belarus has experienced this fate many times in its history. Battleground, contested ground, invasion corridor. The situation of Belarus from the time of the Lithuanian-Muscovy wars all the way through the Napoleonic Wars, the two world wars, the Polish Red Russia War. This has been the fate of Belarus. And the other scenario would be that of buffer, a peaceful area by formal or informal agreement between rival great powers. Countries in the situation of Belarus do not have a discretionary choice between these scenarios. They certainly have preferences, they have choices, but the choices are not discretionary, and the ultimate outcome might be suboptimal is likely to be suboptimal from the point of view of the country affected. At this time, from the point of view of Belarus, the much preferable scenario would be that of a buffer in which Belarus conducts a policy of de facto non-alignment. It would be by definition an unprotected buffer, not part of an alliance system and not part of an international legal settlement. An unprotected de facto buffer, protected by Belarus's own capacity to conduct a policy of de facto non-alignment. Belarus officially aspires to become a neutral state under its constitution and under its national security concept. Belarus officially aspires to become a neutral state. The core elements of neutrality include and we shall see whether Belarus meets these criteria of neutrality. The core elements are no membership in a military alliance, no preemptive commitments in peacetime to support another state militarily in case of war, no deployment of foreign troops on the country's territory, no participation in wars other than defense of national territory. As you have quickly recognized, Belarus does not fully meet these criteria. It meets some of them to some degree, but not fully and not all of them. Belarus is formally bound by alliance treaties and commitments to Russia. The Russia-Belarus Union, the bilateral treaty of alliance, the collective security CSTO treaty. The status of Belarus as a strategic partner of Russia and formal member of Russia-led unions is not in question at this stage. Belarus does not want to cast this status into question. It wants to conduct a policy of de facto non-alignment without openly casting this status in doubt. There is a broad consensus in Belarus for the continuation of the strategic partnership with Russia, however, defining this strategic partnership in ways consistent with Belarus's own national interests. At the same time, the policy of Belarus involves significant elements of non-alignment, with a view to strengthening Belarus's independence and sovereignty. Minsk understands that this policy of what I describe as de facto non-alignment is a prerequisite to full sovereignty and independence, and it is the way to fully normalize relations with the West. This paper proposes to identify the elements of a Belarusian non-aligned policy, to consider their potential for growth, and to aggregate these elements into a tentative model of Belarusian de facto non-alignment. First, the premise. Belarus will not exit the union state with Russia, which exists on paper only. But neither will Belarus go beyond a paper union state with Russia. Belarus will not denounce, not exit the pacts of military alliance with Russia, CSTO, the membership in the Eurasian Economic Union. It will maintain these memberships and will try to extract the maximum possible economic benefits from them. At the same time, Belarus avoids being turned into a Russian outpost, the outpost scenarios that I mentioned earlier. Belarus does not offer a staging area for Russia against the West. Belarus is not a source or a conduit of threats to the neighbors and to NATO.
Vlad, could you, we have about 2 minutes because we have another panel coming up.
Oh.
Could you limit yourself to another?
Am I so close to exhausting my time?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, didn't realize this. In that case, I will move directly to my conclusion and present a checklist of elements of de facto non-alignment in the policy of Belarus. I think I just mentioned a couple of them, but I will present the checklist. Belarus avoids resists being turned into a Russian outpost. It does not offer a staging area for a third party's hostile actions against Belarus's neighboring countries. It does not become a source or a conduit of threats and challenges to neighboring countries. Belarus shall not host Russian combat forces on its territory. Belarus practices military transparency, including inviting Western observers, NATO observers to exercises, Russia-Belarus exercises on Belarus's territory, as Belarus has begun doing. Belarus does not proselytize for Russian proposals on European security. Belarus conducts and expresses its own threats assessments, its own assessments of the international situations, and launches its own independent diplomatic initiatives. Belarus does not become embroiled in Russia's conflicts, nor in Russia's geopolitical or civilizational projects, such as neo-Sovietism, pan-Slavism, neo-Slavism, Russian imperialism, Eurasianism, pan-Orthodoxy. Belarus stays out of the Russian world. Belarus acts as an independent state with a growing sense of its European identity, upholding its national interests in the region and in Europe writ large. Belarus is interacting with the West directly in its own right, not as a member of a Russia-led bloc, and is proceeding in this from its national interests, which are closely tied with the modernization of Belarus. Unlike the Soviet period and even the early post-Soviet period, Belarus does not regard Russia as an agent of modernization and prosperity in Belarus. Belarus looks to the West as the agent of prosperity and modernization in Belarus. Belarus is led by an awareness that its own security and independence is inseparable from that of Europe in the transatlantic context, as distinct from the Eurasian context. Belarusian leaders, including Lukashenko, have expressed this awareness in their dialogues with Western leaders, including their dialogue with the Jamestown Foundation delegation. And finally, Belarus's membership in the Eurasian Economic Union shall remain limited to the economic sphere, without supranational authority, and without political integration with Russia or the other member countries of the Eurasian Economic Union. As you will recognize, these are already the features of the foreign policy that Belarus does conduct. These features have emerged in the last year or 2 years, and the task ahead is to assist Belarus in consolidating a foreign policy on this basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vlad. You're so eloquent that time flies very fast when you speak. It's sorry to cut you off a bit. I'm not sure, how long do we have? Where's Glenn? Do we have... Glenn, how long do we have?
5 minutes.
That's it. Okay. I can go 10. Okay. Let's have the... I was going to ask questions, but let's leave it up to you, please. Somebody have a microphone? Just wait 1 sec. If you could just introduce yourself, your affiliation, try and be brief, and maybe we'll take 2 or 3 and then go to the panelists.
Hi, Danny Anderson, National Endowment for Democracy. I had a quick question, I guess, specifically for Artyom. It's specifically about media, and I know it's not specifically 2030 exactly, but it could have implications for that. I guess after the recent elections, did you or any of your colleagues observe any issues with freedom of operation of media organizations within the past elections, and what do you see, I guess, for the future of free media in Belarus specifically? I know it's a big question. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm not
Yeah, could you wait? Let's take a few. That way we get more in. Another question over here.
Andrei Laronov, Cato Institute. My question probably first of all to Grigory, but maybe some other people would contribute. Speaking about Belarusian difference with Ukraine, why the so-called Vyshnoria, northwestern Belarus that has been so-called names that had been created a couple of years ago, did not play similar role to Galiciana in forming Belarusian identity as Galiciana did play in forming Ukrainian identity?
Okay. Anybody else? Oh, please.
Scott Rowland, Department of State. I was struck by the prediction of several of you that you don't believe there'll be any more strengthening of the Union state or integration. I wanted to ask you, though, if in that calculation you've looked at the year 2024. I think you did, Vladimir, where you were saying Putin will be reelected, but there's a real challenge there that his term is up in 2024, and that the Union State presents one scenario where you would then have an excuse to have a new constitution for a fully developed Union State and elections for a head of that Union State. Do you see any temptation on the part of Russia to push things in that direction?
Okay, thanks very much. Let me throw in one more question, otherwise I won't get a chance. A very practical question. What are the sort of red lines, would you say, for Moscow regarding Belarus's move westwards? In other words, what is it that Moscow simply would not tolerate? Obviously, Belarus isn't on the verge of EU and NATO membership, or even getting a map or an accession plan, if you like. But what would precipitate, in your evaluation, a more assertive, a more, let's say, a bigger crackdown on Belarusian independence from Moscow? Anyway, let's try and handle all these questions. Maybe start with you, Vlad.
About the red lines, right?
About all whatever you want to answer from those questions.
Well, the Russian red lines. Belarus is actually very unlikely to cross the Russian red lines. In my view, the Russian red lines would be Belarus exiting from the Russia-Belarus Union State, Belarus exiting from the Eurasian Economic Union. All of it is highly unlikely. Belarus entering into close relations with NATO. This is a chapter in its own right, which I have in my draft paper. There is a lot of headroom for more cooperation between Belarus and NATO. There is a great deal of headroom, which I have and I'm detailing in my draft paper. But neither NATO nor Belarus are likely to make any provocative moves in this regard. Russia should not be led to believe that it is, quote unquote, losing Belarus. If that perception arises in Russia, that could become provocative and an alarm signal to Russia. But of course, Western diplomacy will be smart enough not to generate such an impression in Russia. And in the meantime, what is happening in Belarus is the consolidation of a domestic political basis for a policy of non-alignment. And that political basis consists first and foremost of administrative and managerial class with a vested interest in the continuation of Belarus's independence and sovereignty. That class is consolidating with every passing year, and moreover, another major interest group is emerging, the interest group of the younger generation of the nomenclatura, interested in developing relations with the West without provoking Russia. And the paradigm shift is that Belarus is looking no longer to Russia, but to the West as a source of modernization. One reason, and this is my final remark, one of the reasons why it is impossible to practice an anti-Russia policy in Belarus at this time and for the foreseeable future is that Russia has been historically the source of modernization, urbanization, education in Belarus. And it enjoys a great deal of prestige and historical memory in this regard. Belarus, an agrarian society where modernization came from Russia. This is what is now ending and being reversed. The West is becoming the source of modernization and development. Thank you.
Artyom?
On the first question of media freedom, there hasn't been much change in this domain since, I would say, last year, so election did not have any particular influence on this. It is the sort of slightly mythical idea that Belarusian regime becomes more authoritarian on the eve of election, especially towards the media. We've had some setback in terms of media freedom in 2017 and 18 with some infamous criminal cases. But after that, I would say the situation is largely more or less stable, with Belarusian, regime of media restriction being where it was. I would also address the second question on the union state possible strengthening in 2024 idea. It can be discussed for hours, but I would say that in brief, all the other options for Putin to, pass this 2024 or resolve this 2024 dilemma are less costly and less risky than a Belarusian scenario. Let's put it this way, because first elephant in the room is Belarusian fundamental, lack of desire to participate in this, neither on the public level, nor on the authorities level. And what is even more in these circumstances important, Lukashenko personally will probably resist it to the last drop of his political blood. And what I mean by this is there is no amount of economic pressure or economic carrots you can propose to him to abandon his position. And the union state under Putin would, needless to say, be the end of political career of Alexander Lukashenko, and with the very, vague guarantees for his family, which cannot be trusted in Russian case. So you are seeing that to make this scenario happen, you will need to somehow remove the current Belarusian regime from power. And Russia is not particularly successful in toppling regimes. Russia has not toppled any regime in the recent decades. And authoritarian regimes are probably the hardest to overthrow, since you don't have much politics to meddle. And therefore, to imagine Putin starting some sort of paramilitary-like scenario to remove Lukashenko and his bureaucracy from office, just to avoid creation of some sort of another article in Russian constitution to create a state, Gossovет for himself, I'd say that it's just, improbable to suggest that the costs of this scenarios can be lighter than in others.
Okay, thanks so much, Grigory.
There was one question, why so-called Vyshnoria did not play the same role as Galiciana in boosting, I guess, Belarusian nationalism. Well, the only thing I can say is that Galiciana is a natural historical entity where the roots of present-day Ukrainian nationalism have been for quite some time, whereas Vyshnoria is a mythical entity along the lines of Ernest Gellner's Ruritania or Ilya Ehrenburg's Republic of Labardan. It doesn't exist in reality. What I'm trying to say is that the cultural divide of the magnitude, that is characteristical for Ukraine doesn't exist in Belarus, period. Therefore, Vyshnoria could not possibly play the role, a mythical entity, that the real custodian of Ukrainian nationalism, which is Galicia, has played over a long period of time. In fact, since long before the demise of the Soviet Union. That's all I can say.
Okay, thanks very much. Andrew?
To add briefly to your question about Putin possibly moving positions into 2024. Well, remember that this option was discussed in 2007 and rejected. And they came up with the idea of castling with Medvedev instead. And from what I remember about discussions at the time, the reluctance came about because it wasn't a big enough position for a power behind the throne. And secondly, the idea comes from what Milosevic did in swapping from Yugoslav to Serbian president, blah, blah, blah. But Yugoslavia already existed. Everything was much more tightly knit. That was actually physically easier, if you like, for Milosevic's castling. So that's why it was rejected back in 2008. The counter-argument is that you wouldn't want to castle with Medvedev again, but that just means that's an even worse argument. So there are plenty of better options for Russia. And just briefly about Vyshnoria, which I could produce by magic. Yeah. So this was actually part of a military exercise a couple of years ago. The idea that this blue part of northwest Belarus was the center of sedition. Some people produce passport stamps. It's the old Vilna province, okay? So just to add to what Grigory said, the answer is Vilnius, right? Isn't there, right? Galicia was based on Lviv. Historically, Ukraine ended up with all of that territory, but Belarus doesn't have the primate city because Vilna became Vilnius.
Up to a point.
Well, historically, no, because Vilnius was supposed to be the center of all this. So it's a bit like a dead star. So the signal's still coming out, but the star is dead.
No critical mass.
Yeah.
The Belarusian society is far more homogeneous than Ukrainian one in this regard.
Okay, we could go on for the next few hours, I'm sure, and maybe at some point we will, Glenn. Glenn, thanks very much for organizing it. Thanks to the panelists. All deserve a round of applause.